And last but not least, we've got Henry Huntington from the Pew Group in the United States, right? It's based in Washington, D.C.?
Washington and Philadelphia, yes.
Washington and Philadelphia. And you're relatively latecomers to the Arctic scene, but you come in gangbusters. Tell us just maybe a little bit about your organization and why the Arctic has become such a focal point for your group.
Sure. The Pew Environment Group is a large foundation in the U.S. and has been around for well, we started in the late 40s and early 50s. They've had a strong interest in environmental issues around the world, especially marine issues, fishing and things, starting in the U.S. and then expanding to other places. And with the attention being given to the Arctic, with the rapid changes that are happening and so on, it seemed like a logical step for them, I think, to look into what was happening in the newly opening waters of the Arctic.
It's a big learning curve, wouldn't you say?
It is a big learning curve. Personally, I've been involved in Arctic research for almost 25 years, so I have a little more background. For me, it's been interesting trying to learn the conservation side of things. The theme of this conference is from knowledge to action. Acting on the scientific knowledge we have and turning that into sound conservation policy is certainly one aspect of that. And it's an interesting challenge to try to take the science you have and make the best use of it when you're making sound decisions that will affect the future of the Arctic.
So if you're to give the advice of people who are going to try to come up with an action or knowledge to action plan, what would you tell them? Because this, I think, is the million-dollar question that everybody's trying to answer and is having trouble with it.
We think, well, we'll do our research and we'll publish it in a scientific journal, and surely somebody will pay attention. And surely this will address some important question. But the timeline of scientific research is often quite a bit slower than decisions. If somebody wants to make a decision about, as you were discussing with Dave Barber earlier, where a ship lane might go if the Northwest Passage is opening up or something like that. They don't want to be told, well, give us 5 years to study that and analyze the data and we'll get back to you. They want to know what they can do this summer because the ship will start going through that in July or August. And what can we tell them at that point? And I think what's needed in my view is much more of a dialogue between the decision makers and the scientists, partly just to learn how to speak each other's language. Earlier this week we had Deputy Undersecretary of Interior from the U.S., David Hayes, who addressed the conference and also had a small meeting with a few of us. And in there he was discussing the landscape of northern Alaska and the challenges of dealing with different conditions and so on. And what was going through my mind was an ecological map or a topographic map of vegetation and where the tree line was and elevations and so on. And then he said, yeah, the big problem is all the different jurisdictions. And all of a sudden, a different map appeared in my head, which is the one with the land ownership. What's the federal land? What's the state land? Which agency? Which is private land? And I realized, yeah, of course, that's the world he inhabits, is who owns that land and what can they do with it. And so merging that ecological map with the sort of political ownership map, I think that learning to communicate across both of those domains is one of the crucial parts. And that doesn't happen without dialogue.
Well, one of the things that's also lost in the debate is that there's a great deal of ownership by the Inuit as well through their land claims, and that they've got to have some say in governance.
Absolutely, and that's a crucial part of the equation. So science is one of the inputs into decisions, but certainly not the only one. There are a number of other societal values, and I think the trend with the land claims agreements and so on, starting in Alaska and working across the Canadian North and the recent developments in Greenland, is putting more power in the hands of the Inuit or other indigenous or aboriginal peoples. And that's a good thing, because they're the ones who are facing the consequences of whatever happens in their lands, and hopefully accruing the benefits of whatever's done there.
Could we ever have an Arctic treaty similar to an Antarctic treaty? I know that there are people living there, and that makes a big difference because there's no one in Antarctica. But I mean, could we have something like that to serve as at least an omnibus way of dealing with a lot of local and regional issues?
A lot of people have talked about those kinds of things. I guess I see that as being problematic and perhaps not necessary, in that the Antarctic had a number of land claims and so on that had been made by different countries. Britain claimed a slice, and Australia claimed a slice, and Norway claimed a slice. And it was partly to sort of put those on hold that the Antarctic Treaty was set up. But nobody was really affected. It wasn't there wasn't a community that suddenly went from being Norwegian to being Argentinian. In the Arctic, the land is all nationally, in national jurisdiction. There's no question about who owns Ellesmere Island. There's no question about who owns the North Slope of Alaska. And so the typical national laws and jurisdictions and so on do cover a lot of things.
Except if you have an oil spill in Northwest Passage and it drifts into
there are a number of transboundary issues, and what you were just talking about with Haley about contaminants is a good example. The search and rescue agreement that was concluded recently is a good example. Transboundary oil spills, fisheries issues, and things like that. I think there are a number of issues like that. I think that there's a little fear with the treaty of sort of how much you cover and how that cuts into national sovereignty, and so perhaps it's easier to work our way there with things like the search and rescue treaty. I mean, who could be opposed to having a good search and rescue plan? Somebody's lost at sea. You want them rescued. You don't want to be sort of wondering going back to a
that's
map.
the easy part.
Well, that is the easy part. We're the Pew Environment Group is looking at a fisheries agreement for the Central Arctic Ocean. Now that is the territory for the part of the sea beyond national jurisdictions. We'd like to see an agreement that we should hold off on fisheries there because we really don't know enough about it to be able to set up a proper fishing catch limit or anything. We see that as a step towards international cooperation, recognizing that there are a number of things that we have in common and that we share, and that perhaps we can start to take a more collective view or a collaborative view of looking after the Arctic. And I think we see evidence of that with things like the Arctic Council. We're taking steps in that direction, and if we keep it on a pace that people are comfortable with, then maybe we move in the direction of addressing things collectively.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm getting the sense, from scientists like David Barber and others at this conference, is that the change is happening a lot more quickly than we originally thought. And this seems to be a repetitive thing, that every 3 years we realize we're wrong. The changes are happening, we're right, but we're just not keeping up with how quickly things are changing. So I'm getting a sense, I don't know, a sense of urgency that we really need some action now rather than later.
Well, we need a tremendous amount of action. What we need to have is action that takes into account the uncertainty that we have. And I'll give an example from northern Alaska. Prior to 2007, walrus hauling out on the shore in northern Alaska was a pretty rare phenomenon. A few individuals would haul out here and there and so on, but that was about it. In 2007, with the record ice retreat in the summer, tens of thousands of walrus came ashore. This is an unknown phenomenon before. That's happened again in almost all the years since then. So what do we do with that? This is a new phenomenon. We don't know if it's a regular pattern. Will they always come to the same place? Are they coming to one place until they've eaten it out of house and home and they'll move somewhere else? We're now trying to make decisions about offshore oil and gas, which will involve coastal infrastructure, offshore facilities that might be between the walrus and their feeding grounds. These are structures that will be there for perhaps a few decades. We're trying to deal with that in the face of a walrus behavior that has just changed rapidly in a couple years and may change in another way coming soon. The only way that I know of to deal with that is to build in a fair bit of buffer because we have the uncertainty. If we try to narrow things down and assume that, they'll always be on the same beach, I think history and the rapid change that we've been seeing would suggest that that's not a safe bet. But we need to account for a number of unexpected things happening and give the system as big a chance as we can to accommodate as best it can.
Let me ask you one last question, and I think this is perhaps one of the most difficult ones to answer, is that public policy is often shaped by public opinion. But public opinion about the Arctic is sometimes ambivalent, sometimes indifferent. If we're going to move politicians in this direction, we've really got to win over the public. How do you do that?
That is a difficult question, you're right. But I think the Arctic is it's also an iconic and well-known place. How many covers of National Geographic have a polar bear or an Inuk or some iconic image from the north? It's high in people's consciousness. And I think what we're seeing at the level of interest at this conference and so on, it's going to stay there. And I hope the International Polar Year will help give that a boost. The challenge is how do we sustain that so people do keep thinking about the Arctic as we go forward.
Good. Well, on that note, I wish us all luck.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for coming.